All right, first up, I'm going to talk about the case of Professor Peter Ridd. It's a high-profile case of academic freedom. He was a former professor at the James Cook University in North Queensland, fired in 2018 in the context of ventilating his view that the Great Barrier Reef is not in the throes of a climate change-induced crisis. He sued and he won, but then James Cook University appealed and JCU has just won, and that was last week, hence my raising the issue now. And I want to back up from the detail of the decision because it can all get a little bit, lost in the weeds. For a second, I want to put this into context. Ridd has a PhD in physics. He joined the Australian Institute of Marine Science in 1980, started studying the Great Barrier Reef in 1984. He was the head of the JCU Physics Department between 2009 and 2016 and the head of the Marine Geophysical Laboratory for 15 years. Ridd challenged the prevailing narrative that the Great Barrier Reef was under imminent threat and wrote a great deal about what he believed to be issues of quality control in the marine sciences, and talked a lot about calling for reforms, replication of studies, a supervisory body, these kinds of things. Now, his troubles seem to have first started on 16th of December 2015. He sent an email to a journalist and it said that the Great Barrier Marine Park Authority and the ARC Centre for Excellence in Coral Reef Studies should, quote, check their facts before they spin a story. He was asked about a particular story that had come out of these institutes by the journalist. And he went on to say that if challenged, his, quote, guess is that they will both wriggle and squirm because they actually know that these pictures are likely to be telling a misleading story and they will smell a trap. Now that got him a formal censure from the James Cook University, directing that his future public comments be in a collegial manner, upholding JCU and the reputation of his colleagues. So in other words, they're saying do not criticise these bodies in the way that you have. It's not very nice. They said that was according to the requirements of his code of conduct, which are a little vague, but I guess you can work it in there somehow. On the 1st of August 2017, which is over a year later, Ridd appeared on Sky News with Alan Jones and Peter Credlin, and he talked about his area of expertise, the Great Barrier Reef, and particularly the effects of ocean currents, sediment, erosion and temperature on the reef itself and the overall health of the reef. And he talked about a key area of concern for his academic concern, which is that the quality control issues that he believed existed in the field of marine sciences. Now, this interview was the beginning of the end for Peter Ridd. This really, as far as I can tell, is the crisis point of the whole thing. A lot happens subsequently, and it turns into this rat's nest of complex back and forthing, and there's confidentiality directions and speech directions and a satire direction, whatever that is, made by the university, and Peter Ridd goes out there and he starts proceedings in the Federal Circuit Court, and he distributes a flyer on campus, and he talks to some journalists, and he says that to a student that this is Orwellian, and JCU gets very upset about that. All of that happens, but this really is the point at which it went wrong, this interview on Sky News. He said the following, and by the way, the whole interview, and I went back and watched it, 1st of August 2017, I found the footage. The whole interview is very balanced, very calm, very measured, quite scientific. He talks about the scientific areas of his expertise in relation to the reef, how the health of the reef is not under threat, why he thinks that in his particular field. And he also makes some comments as well about the issues of quality control that I just spoke about. And these are the most inflammatory points from the whole interview, and delivered calmly, measuredly, and respectfully when you watch it. And he said this, quote, "This is again an example of, well, yeah, we're just not quality checking the science. Interestingly, if you look at the biomedical sciences area where they've done these replication studies, they're finding that the important science is wrong around half the time. Now I ask you the question, if this is a problem in the biomedical area, and this is now very well recognised, shouldn't we now start checking some of this environmental science where, in addition to the normal problems we have with poor quality, we also potentially have scientists with an ideological bent?" He raises that point, continues speaking. Alan Jones then sticks the boot into the scientist's motives a little bit, and then Ridd says the following. He says, going back to a point you made earlier about the scientists, who pays the piper calls the tune, that's possibly a bit harsh. I think that most of the scientists who are pushing out this stuff, they genuinely believe that there are problems with the reef. I just don't think that they're very objective about the science that they do. I think that they're emotionally attached to their subject, and you really can't blame them. The reef is a beautiful thing. Now that is as bad as it got, if I could put it that way. Now, that is I think a measured criticism. And yet on the 24th of August, Ridd is told in relation to this interview that he's engaged in serious misconduct, which is the most serious charge the university can make against him in his employment, and disciplinary proceedings within the university begin. Now, the crime, according to them, is that he failed to act in a collegial and academic spirit and failed to treat fellow staff members, students, and members of the public with honesty, respect, and courtesy. Now, a lot of that is open to a lot of subjective interpretation of what amounts to respect and can you criticise at all and how should you criticise and what words should you use and all the rest of it. I encourage you to find the clips of that interview. They are out there and see for yourself. So Ridd is now fighting for his job at this point. This is where it all went wrong. He sets up a GoFundMe page, raises quite a lot of money to challenge his discipline in the federal court and takes it from there. Now, the fact of the matter is that Ridd's enterprise agreement is very clear. It says in there that there's an intellectual freedom clause, clause 14. And it says in there very clearly that he is able to criticise and he is able to engage in robust criticism, that he is able to ventilate unpopular opinions. It says there that he is free to critique the operation of James Cook University and academic disciplines and all sorts of things. When you read it, you go, oh wow, what he has done is squarely within the terms of the intellectual freedom clause of his actual enterprise agreement. It even just puts a limit there which says basically so long as you don't vilify, bully, harass colleagues. Now, there's no question really from what he did that there was any of that going on. However, in addition to that intellectual freedom clause, the university itself had a code of conduct which made this short comment about treating staff and others with respect and collegiality. And the university said, well, that's enough reason to do all of this. Whereas Peter Ridd was arguing, no, the intellectual freedom clause in my enterprise agreement is enough. It tells me everything I need to know. And besides which, the court agreed that actually that code of conduct clause was very vague, it wasn't capable of easily being adhered to, and so on and so forth. Now, apparently, that wasn't good enough. Apparently that was enough, that even though it was unclear. The judges said that the university could limit the intellectual freedom clause with its own code of conduct, and so effectively that intellectual freedom clause wasn't worth a whole lot, or even though it was limited by vague terms. Court didn't seem to mind. Secondly, the judge said that the principle of intellectual freedom was not a historical principle foundational to a university context, if you can believe it. Said they preferred instead to say that there is, quote, no common understanding of the principle in the university sector. And whatever it is in particular context, it has evolved with contemporary circumstances. Isn't that extraordinary? So here's a question. And the contemporary circumstances, by the way, they make vague appeals to social media and internet and so on. But here's a question. If intellectual freedom is not foundational to a university context and is not a historical principle of universities, then what in the world are universities for? If intellectual inquiry is not free, then it is not intellectual inquiry. It's obedience to rules, restrictions, and parameters, which is the same as saying no inquiry beyond the boundaries set by someone with power. And I suppose that's really the problem in this case. It says that the rules of cancel culture, political correctness, wokeness, subjective interpretations of what other people's feelings might or could be, this kind of thing, whatever term you want to choose, those rules, those ideas will rule the day, even in a university that claims to uphold intellectual freedom, even in a university where its staff are under an enterprise agreement which makes intellectual freedom principles clear, and yet the university wants to say no, wokeness, cancel culture, etc. will limit all of that. No problem. JCU can claim all it likes, as it does, that its actions against Peter Ridd are not about his differing academic conclusions on the Great Barrier Reef and his measured concerns which were raised over quality control issues. But they made that serious misconduct charge. They commenced proceedings against him, disciplinary proceedings, purely on the basis of that. And they said, oh yes, but you were very offensive. He was not. I've gone back, looked at the interview. It's within his area of academic expertise, which is what, by the way, the Intellectual Freedom Clause says. As long as you're in your area of academic knowledge, all's well. He did nothing more than express an academic view within the bounds of intellectual freedom defined in his own enterprise agreement. But apparently, intellectual freedom means whatever an institution says it means, even if it says that through imprecise and vague and hard to obey rules. Now, I think this case is a shame because it empowers universities to be the woke police and force academics with dissenting views over hot button issues, whether that be environmental issues, whether that be identity issues, sexuality issues, economic issues, whatever, to force a narrative on those issues. And it means universities are not about the pursuit of truth, but it means that they are about the enforcement of that narrative, which is the same as saying that universities are about power and control. And I've said it many times before, and it always proves true, that when truth stumbles, only power remains. Because some people have that view of truth, that one must control the, quote, truth narrative in order to have power over culture. But see, the Christian believes very, very differently. The Christian believes that there is truth which cannot be changed, which has nothing to do with power and control, that all good things proceed from an author of truth, the author of the universe and all of life, the one who's described in John's Gospel as the Logos, or the Word in the English English translation. I can read it to you. It says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. And in him was life, and the life was the light of men." And then John makes this startling revelation. In verse 14, he says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." Who knew that a rejection of that standard of truth would lead to so many different effects in our society? One of them being, potentially, really the death of mainstream intellectual freedom. Hey guys, make sure you click like to like the video, or hit the subscribe button down here and click on the bell so you don't miss any notifications. And to watch more videos, just click here. Cheers. Go on, click one. You know you want to.